I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, a long-time member of our Roundtable. How long have you been a member at the Roundtable?
Not like you.
I know that.
5 or 6 years.
About 5 or 6 years. He's Stephen Miller. He's given us a number of talks on the Hunley, keeping us updated. I believe you're a member of the Hunley Association. So he has access that we don't have, which is nice. So we depend on him to know what's going on with that. So with that said, I invite you up to give your talk to us.
I was just going to say, for those who knew, saw my first talk at the Bullets of the Civil War, I talked quite a bit in that. When I started researching that, I was totally blown away by how many submarines there were in the Civil War. I would guess anywhere from 20 to 30. But the ones I'm going to talk about, I don't need that. I thought I had a booming clear voice. So tonight, I've been studying more and more about the Hunley and the mystery as to what happened to her after she sank the Lusitania. And I'm going to expand on that tonight and give you my own theories of what happened to her. I also hope to get a little bit of feedback from you folks because it is quite a mystery and there's a lot of different conflicting clues. It's a very interesting subject. But I will start out tonight with the CSS Pioneer was the first boat made by James McCormick, Horace Hunley, and Baxter Watson in New Orleans in 1862. The Union had 2 gunboats and a bunch of training that were really giving the Confederates a hard time. The Confederates had no gunboats to counteract them, so they decided to build a submarine. There's some people in the Confederacy that thought submarines were very useful along the coast of the United States. So the first boat they built was called the Pioneer. And it was built in a machine shop in Watson and McClintock's machine shop in New Orleans. And it was built of old boilers. It was 4-inch thick metal. They built it for $1,500. It was approximately 30 to 35 feet long and 4 feet in diameter. Had a crew of 3 men, 2 rowers and 1 pilot. And you can see at the top, this is a pretty good rendition of it from the mechanical drawings that made at the time. In the middle of the 2 conning towers, you see a large silver cylinder. That was the mine. And how this mine was delivered, it would have to go underneath the boat it attacked, screw the mine to the hull, paddle away, and set it off with a lanyard. It was pretty risky business, as you can imagine. They thought the diving time was about 15 minutes, but they did some tests and found it could actually stay down about 2 hours. They tested it out and they sank 2 barges and an old schooner. Unfortunately for the Confederates, Farragut took New Orleans. And when American troops came ashore in New Orleans, the Confederates set everything they could on fire. There were thousands of cotton bales burning along the shore, ammunition exploding all over the city, and Hunley and Watson and McClintock took their plans and hightailed it to Mobile, Alabama, where they set up at the Parks and Lions machine shop and met a fellow named William Alexander. William Alexander was a machinist and engineer who recently moved from Great Britain, and he and Horace Hunley became very good friends. As a matter of fact, he became Hunley's second in command. And William Alexander also had ties with a fellow named George Dixon, who we'll also talk about, who became the captain of Hunley. They were both members of the 21st Alabama. 21st Alabama got chewed up very bad at Shiloh. Had lost about 33% of the men killed. And after that, the 21st was moved to Mobile Bay to become part of the defenses of Mobile. And George Dixon became very involved in the setting up of artillery to defend Mobile. And when he was asked to move to Charleston, which I'll get to in a little while, it was very well resisted. They did not want him to leave Mobile. He was a very handy fellow to have around. The second boat, afraid I'm going to put this down a second. So we're going to do this. I hope this works. The second boat, the worst thing about this is the only thing I could get of it. The American Diver, it was named the Pioneer 2, and then later on dubbed the American Diver. I hope you can all hear me. It was 36 feet long, 3 feet in width, and 4 feet tall. It had a crew of 5 men, 4 on a crank and 1 pilot. And they tried all kinds of innovations with this. They wanted to power it with an electromagnetic motor. When I first heard that, I went, electric motor in the Civil War? But they did have electric motors in the Civil War. They also had galvanic batteries, acid lead batteries. Surprising enough. Unfortunately for them, they had $5,000 to spend on this. Oh, by the way, I like to say the Pioneer was built for $1,500. And after it was sank, the new base was developed by the Confederates. Sort of missed that in my note. The Northern troops immediately found it, pulled it on up, looked at it, and went, huh. Sold for scrap for $42. So like a joke, they spent $1,500 on it, sold it for $42. That was the starting of modern military spending. Now I'll get back to the American Diver, sorry about that. She had a crew of 5, 4 crankers and 1 pilot, and they had $5,000 to spend on her, which Horace Hunley put up his own money. Horace Hunley was a very wealthy man. He was a customs, he took in customs monies. He was also a planter. McClintock was the youngest riverboat pilot on the Mississippi River. And Watson, what happened about Watson? He owned the machine shop that they built it in. Kind of going back and forth here. If I brought my bifocal, I can see that, but I'm looking past my glasses here. So I guess I'll do. So they decided, well, we have $5,000 to build a summer. And it was a vast improvement. You can see it's not conical in the front, it's wedge-shaped. It has 2 conning towers, very similar design to the Hunley, as we'll see. She also had a long pole with a mine in the front, like the Hunley used. The electric engine they tried to find for it, unfortunately, cost $5,000. And even more unfortunate, it was in New York City. It's pretty hard to get stuff from New York City to Mobile Bay at that time. So the Confederates built their own electric motor. They didn't have very good machine shops in the South, being a very agricultural nation, so the motor they came up with was very inadequate, and it could only push the American Diver about 2 knots tops. And they said, that's no good. So they said, well, let's try a steam engine. The Davids running steam engines. Of course, they have a smokestack coming up out of the water. So their idea was to build a boiler, build up a steam pressure in the boiler, shut the burner off, and run off the steam in the boiler. But unfortunately, they didn't have boilers strong enough to hold that much steam, so they had to scrap that idea. Then they had the idea, let's use an ammonia motor. They had ammonia motors that ran the streetcars in New Orleans. I'm just amazed at all the stuff they had. Unfortunately, ammonia motors give off really bad fumes. And being in a submarine with bad fumes is not a good idea. So they thought, what the heck, let's go back to the crank. So they went to the crank, 4-man. This top speed was only about 4 knots. And it had a very short life. It was ready in January of 1863. The next month in February, they're towing it up to Mobile Bay to do some testing, perhaps on a mission, and it sank. There were no people on board. It just swamped over and sank. It was a bad day. And interesting enough, the fellow Clive Cussler, who founded the search for the Hunley, is now looking for the American Diver. So hopefully he'll find it someday. This is the interesting mock-up here. This is in Charleston. This is a model the Hunley made before it was found. This is what they thought it would look like. And they have some things right and some things wrong. The basic shape, the length and width are about right, but the conning towers are totally different. The conning towers each on the Hunley had 2 portholes on the front. One on the right side, one on the left side, and they had what's called a shear water, a long wedge-shaped piece of metal to part the water as it goes through the water so that the water wouldn't hit the conning towers and make little white caps. They were trying to be sneaky. Also, the Hunley's, the pole for the mine was made of metal and was on the bottom of the boat. was about 20 feet long. We'll talk more about this, but I just threw this in here because it's very interesting to see this in downtown Charleston. Walking along and dang, there's a Hunley, or something thereof.
The welding is different too on that.
Yes. Oh, very, very astute. I'm glad you said that. One thing that I'll show you on this picture of the Hunley. This is the Hunley the way it would look. A very sleek one. You notice the picture that I just showed you. All the rivets were sticking out. When they built the Hunley, they actually countersank the rivets. So the rivets go into the metal, and then they ground them off flush with the hull so there would be no drag. I don't know how much drag a couple hundred rivets could put on a submarine, but they're going for all the performance they could. The Hunley was 40 feet long, 4 feet high, and about 42 inches wide. It was like getting into a propane tank. And they had a crew of 8. The keel was laid early in 1863, and she was launched in July of 1863. She cost $15,000. You have to understand that's about 1,000 months' wages for the average worker in those days. So that was a bit of cash for those days. Hunley threw in a third, and the Singh Corporation put in another third. The other third were other investors. The first submarines had letters of marque from the Confederate government. A letter of marque basically made them a legal privateer. And the deal was if you sank a Monitor, you got $100,000. If you sank any other ship of war, you got $50,000. So that might explain some of the motivation why these guys signed up for these submarine duties. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But they had letters of marque. In August 12th of 1863, a very mysterious train went from Mobile to Charleston, South Carolina, and it was covered with a tarp, and on 2 flat cars was the Hunley. It was extremely heavy. It weighed between 6,000 and 7,000 pounds, and it was covered with a canvas, but everybody knew what it was. You know, I mean, the Southerners knew what it was. They all knew where it was going. The Northerners knew what it was. They all know where it was going. It was the worst kept secret of the war. The Hunley was going to South Carolina. So there are many myths and tragedies about the Hunley. One of the myths was that she sank 6 times, killing 35 crew members. Twice in Mobile Bay and 3 times in Charleston Bay. But with all history, myths have to be included in history. So the myths are simply myths. The Hunley sank 3 times, which is still not good. The first time was should have brought my Bible. The first time was at Fort Johnson, August 29th, 1863. The Hunley had been out during the day practicing dives. She was coming into dock, and she had surfaced, and the air, as you can imagine, inside a hull like that, extremely foul. As a matter of fact, the crew always talked about when they opened the hatches, the air tasted like it had sugar in it. It tasted so good. She was coming into Fort Johnson, and with the hatches open right on the surface, and their captain at that time was Lieutenant Payne. He tried to get up on the hatchway. Imagine the hatchway is only 16 by 14. So how wide are your shoulders? These guys would literally have to go in like this. So he was up in the hatchway. Once he got his hips hung up, and he started flailing around a little bit. He kicked the dive gun. Because the sub was going forward, the planes went down, the sub went down. The Hunley only had approximately 200 pounds of positive buoyancy. So you're talking not very much at all. Maybe 20, 30 gallons of water would sink her. Well, because the hatches were open, she went down, water poured into the hatch, and she sank into 42 feet of water. Payne managed to get out, and another crew member, could never find his name, a guy named Charles Sprague got out, and a guy named Charles Haskell got out. Haskell was the lucky one. He went all the way to the bottom with it. He was trying to get the hatch open, but he couldn't get the hatch open. Finally got down. The pressure was, he got the hatch open, he swam up to the top. He was just as good as dead as anybody else. They pulled him out of the water.
and rolled him over a barrel, which is the way they did CPR back in those days. They coughed and sputtered back to life. Charles Haskell has an interesting history after that. He became friends with Simon Lake. I don't know, anybody know who Simon Lake is? Simon Lake is considered the father of submarines. Simon Lake designed all the submarines for the British and for the Americans during the First World War. And Charles Haskell, the survivor, the lucky survivor of the first sinking of the Hunley, was a collaborator to him and taught him all he knew. So Haskell, he did good. But anyhow, I have a lot of information here. I have the names of the crews who died, but people tell me when I lecture I tend to do overkill on details. So if anybody wants to know who the crew members who were died, bad thing about Charles Sprague, I mean, he managed to survive. He stepped on enough heads to get up the hatch, and of course when it went down, when they pulled it up, there was two divers named Smith and Broadfoot. They were from Scotland, and they were hard hat divers. They had copper helmets and oil canvas outfits. They went down, they found it, and of course all the men were all crowded up trying to get up the hatch, but Charles Sprague got up. Unfortunate for Charles Sprague, he was in the Hunley the second time sank too, when they all died. So you talk about, you just could get away from it. The second sinking was October 15th, 1863. This is interesting because by now, George Dixon was the commander of the vessel. And his friend William Alexander was the second in command. Now, the second in command, the Hunley dove and surfaced very simply. They had two ballast tanks, one forward, one aft, and they had pumps. And when they wanted to go down, they would open a sea cock and let the ballast tank fill up. And when they wanted to rise, they would close the sea cock and pump the water out. So, this is how they did it. And Alexander was the one who manned the back pump. Dixon manned the front pump. He also was kind of navigator. And so, anyhow, interesting enough, they're going to do this test. And Horace Hunley goes up to Dixon and says, "Hey, I want to take her out to eat." And a young fellow named Thomas Park, who was the son of the owner of the Park and Lion machine shop in Mobile, said to William Alexander, "I want to be second man today. You can have a seat. We'll take her out." So they spent the afternoon diving and surfacing, diving and surfacing. They dove underneath the engine chief. There were, by the way, 3 ironclads in Charleston Bay at the time: the Chicora, the engine chief, and the I knew I was going to forget this one, the Palmetto State. And they were doing dives. How the Hunley ran at this time had a 150-foot line behind it with a 135-pound charge of powder. The object was to go underneath the enemy ship and drag that keg of gunpowder into the side of the enemy ship and blow it up. So they were practicing their dives, and the engine chief guys are on their boat, and there goes the keg, and you hear the bump, yeah, okay. Went down, didn't come up. Everybody's kind of waiting. A couple bubbles come up. They're waiting, they're waiting, they're waiting. Didn't come up. Well, a couple of weeks later, Smith and Broadfoot went down, found it again, and when you start hearing about the problems that modern divers had with finding the Hunley, you wonder how these guys back in 1863, with their copper helmets and their oil canvas wetsuits, would go down in pitch darkness, and when you get down the bottom of Charleston Bay, you sink up to your thighs immediately. And these guys went down there and brought the submarine up twice. And both times, the bodies were in such bad shape that at one time they actually had to cut the arms off the bodies to get them out of the portholes. This is, so years later, William Alexander gave told why the Hunley sank this time. Hunley messed up. Hunley forgot to close the sea cock. and they took their dive, and unfortunately the design of the Hunley, the ballast tanks didn't have tops on them. They're open on the top. So if they overflowed, there was only one place for the water to go. The water went into the Hunley. So they were diving down, and the front ballast tank was full. They started diving down harder and harder, and all of a sudden, they hit the bottom. Everybody pushed forward. They all felt the cold water on the bottom. They all panicked. They all packed up to the stern of the boat. That's where they all died. Of course, they found Hunley in the front hatch, standing there with his hand over his head, and the other fella was in the stern hatch with a hand over his head. They were trying to push the hatch open. Unfortunately, even if you're only they sank that time in 6 fathoms, which is 54 feet. At 54 feet, there's a equivalent SUV on top of every hatch, on both hatches. There's no way you can open it up. Unless the water gets in the boat, equalizes the pressure, and then you can pop it open. By then, the water will be up to here. And the water is extremely cold in Charleston Bay. They probably died of hypothermia or asphyxiation. It was not a good thing. After this, Beauregard, Pierre Gustave Beauregard, General Beauregard, who was in command of Charleston's defenses, said, "That's it. We're canceling the Hunley project." And Dixon said, "No, you can't do that. It's not the boat's fault. It was the fault, both times was operator error, we'll call it. That's what we call it these days." He said, "It's not the boat's fault." So, Beauregard said, "Okay, but surface only." And Dixon threw another hissy fit. He said, no, it won't be effective on the surface. So, Beauregard said, "Oh, what the heck. If you can find another crew crazy enough to go on there with you, you can do it." So Dixon went over to the engine chief and said, "I need some volunteers to go into what everybody was calling the killing machine." That was the nickname the Confederates gave it to. Actually, until Hunley died in it, it was called the fishboat. After he died in it, they decided to call it the Hunley. And he went over to the engine chief, which is an ironclad in Charleston Bay, and he said, "I need some volunteers to go back into the Hunley." To his amazement, a whole bunch of guys volunteered. So according to what Beauregard said, he had to be up front with him. He had to tell him about the dangers and why it sank twice. Beauregard wanted to say, if you're going to get volunteers, you've got to tell them everything. So Dixon told him everything, and he still had more volunteers than he needed. He got to pick the ones he wanted. Now, one of my first speculations is, why would these guys volunteer to go into this death trap? Was it A, were they uber patriots? B, were they nuts? C, were they just adventurers that wanted to get into something different? Like the guys who jump off the mountains with little wings and stuff like that? Or was it in the back of their mind that $100,000 reward for sinking a Monitor and that $50,000 reward for sinking any other warship, that letter mark? For some reason, he had more volunteers than he needed. And I'll talk towards the end about the names of the men. There was a bit of research to find out who was on the Hunley when it sank. So, now he's got his new crew. Dixon is a very thorough man. Dixon was an interesting man. He was the only Northerner on board. He was from Kentucky. And he moved to the south. He joined the 21st Alabama. He was at Shiloh. And he got hit in the groin by a 58 caliber minigun. Normally for a man, that would be really bad. Fortunately for him, he was carrying a $20 gold piece in his pocket. And the bullet hit the $20 gold piece, creased it, and the bullet went down into the skin of his thigh instead of into where, which would be worse. That $20 gold piece was given to him by his girlfriend, and I love her name. Her name is Queenie Bennett. Queenie Bennett was a rich man's little daughter. She was 15 years old. She was pretty cute. And Dixon was a very good-looking man. He was 6 foot tall, blonde hair, blue eyes, thin and lanky. Hey. It wasn't quite as hairy. But so that's the story about how he got saved by the coin and everything. And the coin was an interesting myth. People talked about the coin for years. And the guy Reagan who wrote the book, and when they did the movie The Hunley, people said, yeah, we can't talk about the coin. That's folklore. But everybody said, yeah, it's interesting folklore. Let's do it. So I'll talk about the coin here a little bit. The first scare they had, they decided with the Hunley, the only way they navigated was a compass. Now you're in an all-steel boat. A compass is going to react very slowly. They had what was called a mercury gauge. There's a tube of mercury that was next to the where the operator stood. The operator stood in the middle of the boat under the front conning tower. There's a mercury tube there with mercury in it. And every half an inch that mercury dropped, that was a foot underwater there. And their lighting was a 6-inch wax candle. It was so dark inside that boat that Dixon couldn't see the last 2 members inside his boat. It was almost pitch dark inside the boat. Now, the air in the Hunley would only support combustion of the candle for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, the candle would go out. There was not enough oxygen left in the boat. Then it was pitch dark inside. Except for maybe if they're close to the surface, a little light coming through the little row of deadlights that you see on there. There's a row of deadlights on there on the top, and a little bit of light would come through that. But they decided, let's see how long we can stay on the bottom. So Dixon took the Hunley out, dropped her to the bottom. In 20 minutes, the candle went out. They were in pitch darkness. So you have 8 guys down there in the dark. It's tight, it's hot, it's smelly. One guy's smoking a pipe. The hull is cold. Moisture is sweating down the hull and running down their backs. And it's getting tighter and tighter in their breathing. The deal was, Dixon said, anybody get uncomfortable, yell up. They sat there for 2 hours and 10 minutes after the candle dropped. Nobody wanted to sit up first. After 2 hours and 20 minutes, the entire crew yelled, up, up! And Hunley started pumping the front tank empty, and William Alexander started pumping the rear pump. The rear pump wouldn't pump. The bow started going up a little bit, but the stern stayed on the bottom. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? In the dark, William Alexander realized something was clogging the pump, took the top out, took the plunger out, reached down, grabbed out a handful of seaweed, put the pump back together, and pumped it out, and popped it to the surface. Open up the hatch, and they said, once again, they said the air tasted like it had sugar. The air was so wonderful tasting. They couldn't believe how good it tasted. There was a fellow on shore, a Confederate soldier said, you guys are dead. Beauregard's already written a report that you died, that the Hunley has taken another crew. Dixon, premature, au contraire. We're okay, we're okay. We now know we can stay down over 2 hours. If we're sitting still. The second scare was in January 1864, a month before the attack on the Housatonic. And the Hunley was kept at the Breach Inlet, which was deep into Charleston Bay, way into it. And they stayed in Charleston. They had to walk 7 miles every day to get to the Hunley. Then they get into the Hunley, pitching and tossing and groaning and squeezing their way through the little hatchway to get in on the hardwood bench, get down there, crouch out, and start cranking. And then they got done after doing that for a couple hours that day. Then they had to get back and walk 7 miles back to the barracks. Well, they'd have to go all the way through Charleston Bay to even get out near where the Federal warships were. And the first Federal warships were monitors. Nobody wanted to mess with monitors. That's why the Davids never had any success. There were up to 6 Davids in Charleston Bay. They never did anything because they couldn't get close enough to the Federal fleet. The Federal fleet, Farragut was no fool. The monitors were ordered to have booms on the sides of the boats and steel nets hanging over the side so to follow up any submarine that came nearby. The wooden warships were told to anchor in shallow water keep up 25 pounds of steam at all times, and have the anchor lines ready to drop at any second. 25 pounds of steam in the water was the standard amount for moving the ship. So that basically kept them fired up all the time, so you can move it at a moment's notice, unless it gets snuck up on like what happened. So, where was that? So, they were, to get around the long roll out Charleston Bay, out past Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie, to get to the Union Fleet, they would be told by a David. Now, we all know, do we know what a David is? David's about 50 feet long, about 4 or 5 feet in diameter, was steam powered, was not a true submarine, could not go completely under the water, had a large smokestack coming out of, and ran just underneath the surface. So, Lieutenant Toombs was command of David. David had a 3-man crew, and he would tow the Hunley out to the mouth of Charleston Bay. Very, very nice little fellow. One day they were towing out, and first was the David. He's towing the Hunley. 150 feet behind the Hunley was 135 pounds of black powder, a keg bristling with all kinds of detonators on it, just ready to go up. And all of a sudden the David stopped for some reason. Nobody ever really figured out. Of course, maybe Toombs thought he'd seen a federal warship or something, and he stopped. He didn't want to be discovered. Tide was going out. Of course, the Hunley came up behind the David, and here comes the mine. And the rope on the mine tangled around the rudder post of the David, and there's the mine sitting there going boom, 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 up against the David. Holy mackerel, Toombs freaked out. He sends one of his crewmen into the water, "Get that thing off my boat!" The guy goes into the icy cold water. You have to understand that Charleston Bay is very cold for some reason. So, especially in January. So this guy's in the water, he's got his back up against the David, he's got his legs on this 135 pounds of powder with all his bristling detonators out, and he manages to push it off the David. The David starts going forward again, and the mine drops back. Well, that was it. After that, Toombs said, "I'm not going to tow that damn thing. No way, you're not getting me near that." So right after that, they moved the Hunley out to what was called Sullivan Island, which is out towards the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. The only bad thing about being out there is that the Union Fleet was out there, the monitors and the big frigates and everything, and they were lobbing shells into Fort Sumter in that area and into Charleston around the clock, 24/7. Something about 100 to 120 rounds a day. And these were big rounds. And on the Sullivan Island area, they were exposed. They could actually hear the shells going over some of the railroad cars going on top. So, I kind of got to have my notes here. So after that, they decided to go back to, as you can see, a boom on the front with a 90-pound powder charge on it. And the object was, the end of the powder charge had a big barb on it, like a harpoon. Object was, whatever you're going up against, you had to go at full speed and ram that barb into the hull. Now, the Hunley could go about 4 miles an hour, 5 miles an hour on the surface, but you could hit 6 or 7 underwater. And like I said, you can see, this is the epitome of technology at the time. She's got, her hull is smooth. If you look at the front conning tower there, you see there's 2 things that look like bazookas behind it. Those are actually snorkels. And those could be stood up so they could breathe when they're just under the water. Of course, they never used it because they're fairly useless. Because if they were high enough to use them, they might as well open the hatch. And if they're low enough that they needed a water would go in them, especially if there's waves, so they couldn't really use them. You notice there's no rivets, it's smooth. You see how small the conning towers are. You see the sheer waters in front of them. One thing they did not want to show us when they were on the surface, that they would have little white caps from the conning towers, so that the sheer waters in front to break the waves, so they could be more stealthful. And they had a cowling around the propeller to project the propeller's force more. And on the inside, the guys in the crank, they had a chain drive. They also had a big, heavy flywheel. Once got the flywheel going, the flywheel kept the propeller going. So that, you know, they just had to kind of keep adding to the flywheel. So Beauregard says, hey, you know, the boom idea is good enough for the American diver. Why don't you go back to the boom? You know, dragging 135 pounds of power behind you, bristling with detonators all over. Let's So then, okay, we'll go back to that. Let's skip on that. So, I told you a little bit about the precautions the North made. The mission, the day of the mission. This is what the inside of the Hunley looks like. You can see it's pretty tight. You can see the pump in the back, you can see the stern ballast tank, you see the top is open. The other thing that shows the mechanism of the flywheel and the chain drive, which is beyond the ballast tank towards the stern. And you can see it's not pretty inside there. It was rusty and wet and dank and smelly. This is a picture of Smith and Broadfoot's idea. The first time when the Hunley sank the second time, this is the one that killed Hunley, she buried herself in the bottom. Interesting enough, there is a very large, thick, heavy keel plate underneath it that if you released it, theoretically the Hunley would pop to the surface. When they pulled up the Hunley this time, the keel bolts had been turned halfway, but not all the way. They tried to drop the keel weight, but it didn't happen. So.
Or the snorkels?
Yeah, the snorkels were out. But it's not as good as they're out of the water. Okay, February 17, 1864. You sure that right? It was the coldest day of the year. There was a full moon. Dixon didn't like the idea of the full moon. Full moon. But they started off from southern the island there where they birthed, and they cranked and cranked and cranked. Now the Hunley typically would dive. They would open up the ballast tanks to get zero buoyancy, what they call, and then the momentum forward. They had diving planes on the side. The diving plane would take them under, and they go under maybe about 20 feet, and they go along maybe a quarter to half a mile, and then resurface, pump the hatches, get some air, close the hatches, and do that again. Therefore, its nickname was the porpoise, because it reminded people of the porpoise how to come up and down like that. And this night, this is a picture by Mark Kunstler. It's pretty accurate. You can see a little bit of light, the front hatch from the candle, a little bit of light coming up with the deadlights. And the 8 crew members got into it. One man is packing canteens. They took salt pork, and they took hardtack so that they had goodies to eat while they're along the way. What they did if they had to go to the bathroom, I have no concept. But I guess it just kind of. But they cranked and they had to go through a screen of monitors because the monitors were untouchable. They had the steel nets, and they were going after one of the what they called a schooner of war, which were 3 massive boats, or big boats. When I think of a schooner, I think of like a 32-foot sailboat, but these were big boats. The one that they happened to be going after that night was called the Housatonic. The Housatonic was a very bad boat. It was a screw sloop. It was 205 feet long, 38 feet wide, top speed of 9 knots, 160 officers and men. Its armament, I'll read, was one 100-pound Parrott rifle, 3 30-pound Parrott rifles, 1 11-inch Dahlgreen smoothbore, 2 32-pounders, 2 24-pounders, 1 12-pound howitzer, and 1 12-pound rifle. So this was a very formidable warship. This is not a 32-foot little schooner. It was a sloop of war. The Housatonic had a reputation with the South. The Housatonic had captured several blockade runners, including the CSS Georgia, which was one of the more famous raiders of the Confederate Navy. The CSS Georgia was coming into Charleston with a load of rifles and ammunition one time, and the Housatonic ran her ashore. So the Housatonic was not particularly in favor of the Confederates. They wanted to get it. So the Housatonic anchored about 4 or 5 miles out that night. It probably took them get there, hard cranking. So these guys were pretty tired by the time we got up. You can imagine, how long do you think you could do this on a heavy flight? I don't know, I couldn't do it for a lot. These guys were different from us. So they're porpoising out there, and they went underneath for a while. They popped up. Dixon looked out the hatch. Holy mackerel, we're 100 yards away from the Housatonic. About that time, somebody in the Housatonic says, "Hey, do you see something out there?" The other guy says, "I saw a tidal river." Nothing. So Dixon's going all speed ahead. Those guys are just giving it all they have after they've been doing it for an hour or two. They're giving it everything they have. And about then, here's the Housatonic. Top speed about 9 knots. All of a sudden they realized that it was not a tidal ripple, it was not a log, it was not a porpoise. It was an infernal machine. By the time they realized that it was the Hunley, of course they thought it was a David at the time. It was too late to depress the guns, but the entire side, starboard side of the Housatonic, opened up a small arms fire. Rifles, double-barrel shotguns, pistols, whatever they had. The guys inside, you could probably hear stuff pinging off. Now, the National Geographic, I'll do an aside, did a very interesting forensics test this year. They actually made a replica of the front conning tower and set it up with glass in it, the portholes and everything, and fired at it with weapons of the period. It turned out that the pistol shots hit the conning tower and splattered like paintball darts. I mean, just nothing. Pickering, the captain of the Housatonic, said he emptied a double-barrel 12-gauge at the Hunley at close range into the front conning tower. Another guy opened up on with a 58 caliber rifle. 58 caliber rifles where everybody was aiming at the front conning tower. It was the only part that was on. Now, when they found the Hunley, the left porthole was out. And also, I'll get more into this, I'm getting ahead of myself once again. Okay. So as you can imagine, in your mind's eye, as they started their approach to the Housatonic, they knew they had to hit her at high speed. Dixon's yelling, "Give her all you got, boys." And he starts giving up the rebel yell, because he was one of those kind of guys that would do the rebel yell. The whole crew probably picked the rebel yell. They're all probably going, "Yeah, yeah, 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 yeah." Boom! They felt that concussion when it slammed into the Housatonic. As a bar was driven deep into the wooden hull. And then Dixon was back, 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 back. They had to stop the momentum to the heavy fly. Get it going backwards. Now they knew they had to sink the Housatonic. Because if they didn't, and if they got too far away from the Housatonic, would sink them. Because the big cannons would be brought to bear. They had 150 feet of line on a real lanyard. They were supposed to back off 150 feet. Now you realize that these days they knew nothing about underwater concussion. Nothing. They knew nothing about the bends. They knew nothing about shock waves. So would 150 feet been sufficient to protect them from a 90-pound charge as it went off? You'll never know. Because according to witnesses in the Housatonic, the charge went off and the Hunley was only 50 feet away. Why did this happen? Perhaps when the bullets hit the reel and jammed it up and made it miss work. But the Hunley was very close to the Housatonic. Here's clue number one. It went off 50 feet away. Now, I propose that anybody touching the hull of the Hunley when that shock wave hit him was either knocked unconscious or had the wind knocked out of him or maybe even concussed. I mean, it would have been pretty much, we all know that shock waves travel faster and stronger in water than in air and through metal better than through water. So if they're 50 feet away when that went by, a shock wave hit them, it was pretty hard. Probably, like I said, it might have knocked some out, it might have just knocked the wind out of them. But there's contradictory clues here. The Housatonic, it was not a big explosion. No one from the shore saw it. I always like to say it's probably more like watching the Housatonic pass gas underwater. say it as polite as I can. But anyhow, the explosion was effective. It blew the entire stern off the Housatonic, cut her drive shaft in half, and blew her rudder off. She sank within 5 minutes. Now you have to imagine, they were trying to cut their anchor lines loose, they were trying to put her in gear to move her, but the Hunley was on too quick, just too quick. They didn't have time. So in those couple of minutes before the Housatonic sank, by the way, the 5 men in the Housatonic were killed, 2 outright, and for some reason one guy went back to his cabin because he had $300 down there, he wanted to get it. He never got back up. Another guy got a lifeboat and said, I can get back on the boat. He went back in the Housatonic and they never saw him again. So 5 guys drowned, and they got 3 boats into the water. The rest of the guys ran up into the rigging like rats and sat, because Housatonic sank in 27 feet of water. And they got away 3 boats, and immediately those boats went around trying to pick up people in the water. Another boat took off and went over to another vessel that looked like the Housatonic called, I have to say this slowly, Canada did go out. The USS Canada did go out. I can spell it. C-A-N-A-D-I-A-G-U-A. However you want to pronounce it. And here the Canada comes rushing in. Now there are a series that perhaps the Canada ran over the Hunley. Because the Hunley, when they pulled her up, she did have some severe hull damage besides the port hull damage, but we'll talk about that in a bit. But the fly in the ointment of that is 15 minutes after the Canada showed up, the blue light was. Now the blue light was a signal that Dixon was supposed to give when he was ready to come back to shore. It was what was called a blue carbon light. It was very, very bright, only about that big around. Now, if nobody saw this light, there wouldn't be so much mystery. But people saw the damn light. Guys in the Housatonic up on the rigging saw the light 800 feet off the stern of the Housatonic. And Confederate soldiers on shore reported they saw the light and they lit the signal fires to guide the Hunley back. So, Canada did not run it on. The Hunley was afloat 45 minutes after the explosion, but the tide was still going out. Now, they knew one thing, they could not fight the tide. No matter how hard they cranked, they could not fight the tide. Keep that in mind. That's the clue. So, years later, when they found the Hunley, another strange clue, they found her seaward of the Hunley, of the Housatonic, farther out to sea, about 500 yards past the Housatonic. And in front of the Hunley was an anchor, stuck in the sand. Now, it was a Civil War era anchor, and it looks like it belonged to Hunley, and they certainly would have taken an anchor with them. If they were being swept up to sea, their instinct would have been to drop an anchor and stop being dragged out. However, with a submarine like that, if you drop an anchor, and the anchor bites, you're going down immediately. You just go, you're going to be pulled down no matter how much ballast you have, no matter which way your diving planes are turned. So, another clue, the anchor. We have clues of how close was the Hunley to the Housatonic when it went off, when the mine went up. It was very close. We have witnesses seeing the blue light 45 minutes after the explosion. The Hunley was still afloat, and someone on the Hunley was still alive and functional. Of course, there had to be several of them because in order to get to the surface, they had to have someone pump the rear tank, someone pump the front tank. So at least 2 guys had to be conscious to bring up to the surface. Then we also know that she was being carried out to sea by the tide, and perhaps they decided to drop an anchor to stop being dragged out to sea. Because being dragged out to sea in a routine submarine would not have been a good idea. So, now, there were myths of the Hunley. Interesting enough, the people in Charleston didn't find out for 10 days that the Housatonic was sank. News didn't get around to it, it was pretty well secret. And then after that, all kinds of stuff happened. Did you hear that the Hunley sank a Yankee ship and escaped to Georgetown, where the big army to go out and break the Yankee barricade? Those men are heroes, they're going to go and they're going to save us. Georgetown is 40 miles away. And another guy said, oh no, I heard they went on a rampage that night. They not only sank the Housatonic, they sank 2 other Yankee ships. One of them was a troop carrier full of Yankee troops fixing to invade us. Well, the Hunley never made it to Georgetown. And the Hunley only carried 1 torpedo. They could not sink 3 boats. But people, you have to understand the people of Charleston, were not very happy people. They were getting bombarded every day, 24/7. These 100-pound shells were arcing in the city, not killing a whole lot of people, but there wasn't a piece of glass in the entire city. And every bit of glass was broken. Buildings were crumbling down. And I don't know if you've been in a bombardment. I haven't, but it could be really a drag after a while. Just having shells come into your town and blow up all the time. Getting a little bit ahead, 1865, our friend Angus Smith, the diver who found the Hunley the first time, said he dove the Housatonic, and the Hunley was right next to the Housatonic. As he said, the small little Hunley was right next to the huge hull of his great victim. So we found out later that was BS. In 1866, a lieutenant named Churchill from the Union Navy went out and surveyed the Housatonic, and he found the Housatonic because the Housatonic was being a pain that took us to all navigation coming into Charleston Harbor because boats kept running her over. I mean, her wood was rotting away quick, but she had 2 40-ton boilers that were sticking up just about 20 feet below the surface. So if you had a boat with more 20-foot draft, you could hit those boilers when you went. So they wanted to clear them. And Churchill dragged the bottom for 500 yards all around. The Housatonic did not find the Hunley. In 1915, P.T. Barnum offered $100,000 for the Hunley. Now, if anybody knew where it was, you think they'd have taken him up on it. There were no takers. Nobody knew where the Hunley was. Now, we're getting in modern times. In 1980, Clive Cussler funded a search for the Hunley. And they looked and they looked and they ran along with the little magnetometers and they found lots of metal on the bottom of the Charleston Bay, but no Hunley. Hunley was buried too deep by then. And in 1989, Category 5 Hugo made landfall in the Carolinas and stirred up the bottom pretty well. And they're starting to think, well, maybe that changed things. It probably did, it probably cleaned up. On May 3rd, 1995, the Hunley was found. And then the salvage operation began. Now you have to understand that Reagan was one of the divers that wrote the book on the Hunley that I read quite a bit of. Oh, it's just the leg cramp? That's great, it's a chest pain. In 1995, they found it. The diving problems were tremendous. Reagan was told the visibility was 0. He thought, well, they mean 2-3 feet. What they meant was 0. There was no visibility. You went down to the bottom, and you immediately sank to your thighs in the bottom, and you couldn't see your glove in front of your face, even though they had powerful searchlights on the sides of their helmets. It was tough work. And they had to dig all around the Hunley, and they would dig underneath it, and every time they cleared a foot underneath it, they'd run a big nylon strap on it. They went all the way along like that. They got nylon straps underneath it. They brought a one called the Carlissa B off of the Dominican Republic. And Carlissa B looks more like a oil rig or oil drilling rig. And they had it there. And on August 8th, 2000, the day came, the Hunley came to the surface. They had a big frame, totally wrapped in the nylon straps and brought to the surface. At that time, there were over 200 pleasure boats hovering around the Carlissa B. And when they brought the Hunley into Charleston Harbor, tens of thousands of people came out to cheer her come in. I mean, these were heroes coming home to the South Carolinians. All the crew was taken to a local cemetery and buried with full military honors, with one of the largest contingents of reenactors ever seen in the United States. Both Union and Confederate were there, and they buried him. The Hunley was taken to a Warren Lash Center and put in a 55,000-gallon tank of water. It had to be put in water because the metal would dry and it would crumble. So, and then they started taking it apart. The Hunley is full of sediment. Another thing interesting, the bottom sediment was very, very fine. And as it built up in it, got coarser and coarser. So that showed the people that the first sediment was fine because the hole that was coming was very small. But then a larger hole was made in the Hunley, and thicker and thicker sediment came in. When they found it, Dixon was standing in the front hatch. His 7 crew members were at their stations. Not like the first 2 scenes where they all crowded the hatches trying to get up. They were at their stations, sitting on the chair. That's where they found the skeletons. They found pencils, shoes, candle, matches, and they kept digging, and they found out that they started finding bones. The crew were at their stations, the seacocks were closed, the counterweight was still attached, there was hull damage. However, they determined the hull damage was done by ships dragging anchors since the Hunley sank. The only damage that they attributed to the battle was some damage done to the front left porthole, because they found part of the inside flange of the porthole was underneath Dixon's body. It had no sediment underneath it, so they hypothesized that the piece of flange hit the bottom before any sediment built up on it. The boat was completely full of sediment. It was completely full of dirt. Interesting enough, the great mystery about Dixon's gold coin was still a mystery, but in May 25th, 2001, a gal named Marcia Jacobson was digging around the muck near Dixon's body and went, here it is. And she pulled it up, there's Dixon's gold coin. To save him from a 58 caliber mini ball in the groin during the Battle of Shiloh. National Geographic did forensics of the conning tower, like I said, and discovered that indeed a 58 caliber mini ball could have damaged the front conning tower to some extent. Now, last year, there was great fanfare. They stood the Hunley upright. She was found at 45-degree angle. That's where they brought her up in her great big frame. They removed the frame and stood her upright. Mona has a great picture if any of you want to see it of the Hunley the way it looks now. They've taken off some of the steel plates. They've taken off most of the concretions and most of the barnacles and stuff off of it. But she's still very, very fragile. I mean, it's like if she dry out, she would crumble into rust. So they have to keep her under water in solution. Now, the crew of the Hunley was an interesting bunch. And the forensics came up with a lot of different ideas who they were. And we know that they found buttons of various artillery, Navy. They even found a United States Army dog tag in the Hunley. And that led to speculations that there's a Union spy in the Hunley. That had to be a very dedicated spy. But it turned out that one of the crew members had picked it up at Shiloh and was carrying it for a souvenir. The commander was George Dixon. George Dixon was from Kentucky. He was a lieutenant of the 21st Alabama, and he's wounded there at Shiloh, and he was transferred to Mobile Bay to help set up their defenses. In fact, twice while he was working in the Hunley, he had to get 30-day extensions to stay in Charleston. He wanted to stay in Charleston. He wanted to command the Hunley. Interesting enough, William Alexander was the second command. He was from Great Britain. He was an engineer, but he lucked out. He was recalled back to to Mobile, just before the Hunley went on its attack mission. Because he had invented a breech-loading cannon, and they needed him in Mobile, so he was in Mobile. All his life, he resented and regretted the fact he didn't die with his crew members. Another interesting one was James Wicks of North Carolina. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1861, and he was on the USS Congress when it was attacked by the Virginia to Hampton Roads in March of 1862. As we all know, the Congress and the Cumberland were totally destroyed by the Virginia. Wicks got off the Congress when it sank, swam to shore, walked to Richmond, Virginia, and enlisted in the Confederate Navy. Joseph Ridgway of Maryland, he was in the Quartermaster's Corps of 1862, and he was the second command when the Housatonic was attacked. Frank Collins of Virginia was from the Indian Chief of the CSA Navy. He was the tallest. He was over 6 foot tall. Now I'm over 6 foot tall. I can't see me jamming through a 14 by 16 inch hatch, but these guys did that. Now, according to the National Geographic special that I just spent $40 on, so I could regale you with these facts, they did forensics on the men's teeth, which were in very good shape, and they could tell what the ponderance of the diet was. For example, Southern men ate a lot of corn, and they could tell the corn molecules in their teeth, where Europeans ate a lot of barley, and 4 members had barley molecules in their teeth. Those 4 members are not very much known. There was a Mr. Miller, who was European, a J.F. Carson, who had served in the infantry. He was a privateer and came from an artillery unit. A Lumpkin, the only record we have of him, he was the oldest. Now, National Geographic says Lumpkin, the Friends of Hunley say Simpkin. They're the same guy, maybe a different rendition of the same name, I don't know. The last man was named Arnold Becker. He was interesting. He was a chef from New Orleans, and we all know about chefs from New Orleans. He was also captain's chef on the ironclad Chicora. And that was the 8 men who died on the Hunley. Now, I'm going to just last before I end up here. Okay, we have clues. We have clues that the Hunley was several witnesses saw the light off the stern, even with the shore on the stern of the Housatonic, probably being dragged out to sea. Okay? Now we also have the other interesting thing, that the crew was found in their stations, and Dixon himself was found his own cone of sediment underneath the hatchway. The other thing was the crew was in their stations. They had not panicked, they did not try to climb up. There were only 27 feet of water. They could have waited until the water came up to their chins, popped the hatch, and swam to the surface. But they made no attempt to do that. Anybody have an idea? Jeanette asked this around. Another interesting thing is in 1904, William Alexander gave an interview, I tend to walk away from him, where he said they had a pact. The whole crew had agreed to a pact that if they sank to the bottom, they'd open the boat and drown. They were not going to be captured. Because if they were captured, they would be tried as pirates. How we hung. So they had that agreement. So my hypothesis was the front conning tower was damaged. There was probably a slow leak in it. Even at 27 feet down, you could probably hold a shirt up against to stop that leak. However, the leak was enough that fine sediment started coming through to start filling up the bottom with fine sediment through the years. And then, of course, as bigger holes got ripped through the Hunley by anchors dragging over, boats running over through the years. What happened to the crew? I think that, my own opinion, now you can tell me if you think I'm full of it or not, I think they were getting dragged out to sea. They surfaced, dropped the anchor, got pulled under. Now, once it got pulled under, there was no way they could open the hatches, go up and release the anchor. They're on the bottom. They're on the bottom. Candle went out in 20 minutes. They were in pitch darkness. The men were exhausted. They had paddled for hours to get out there. They had given it everything they could. When they rammed the barb into the Housatonic and when they backed off from her, they were 110% exertion. They were exhausted. They're sitting on the bottom in the dark and in stillness, in the quiet, lack of oxygen, one by one they fell asleep, never woke up. And the only one who was still alive towards the end was Dixon, standing in the hatchway, talking to nobody who could hear him. That's my theory of what happened. There's a sad ending. The only other types of endings were that, well, you think what Alexander said, open up the seacocks and drown them? The seacocks were closed. So they didn't do that. I just think they died of exhale. They all just fell asleep and never woke up. Plus, you know, they had been stunned by the explosion. Probably at the very least knocked the wind out of them. Maybe knocked someone unconscious. So that's all I have to say tonight about it. That's my theory and I'm sticking with it.
I had a question.
You would.
Because I never knew about those seacocks before. Now, in that picture that you put up there all those seacocks were straight up. Why would those seacocks be up?
No, you're mistaking the snorkels for the seacocks.
The snorkels, I'm sorry, the snorkels. The
Yeah.
snorkels were up. Well, the snorkels, why would the snorkels be up? The snorkels were up, and they
Well,
were breathing air.
in the picture I showed you, that was after the second accidental singing, when the Hunley smashed in the bottom of those things, just the inertia stood them up.
Oh, okay. So
Because they're laying flat back on the back.
so they could go under.
Yeah, they could go up and down. Now, I have one last picture to show you, kind of interesting. Some very smart people did reconstructions of the crew of the Hunley, and upon managed to get the left here is Jordan Dixon, our young man from Kentucky, with gold mine. The next one is Becker, the chef, the mysterious lumpkin, the pipe smoker, and Collins. And the last picture I have to show you, we have Carlson, the mysterious Mr. Miller, Wicks, the guy who survived Congress, and Ridgway. And how they got these is from just descriptions of them from their military papers, and also from reconstruction of the skulls. They have people that are very good at this, and they take skulls and they add clay to it like muscles, and they add skin, and this is what they come up with what these men look like. So these are the crew that gave it their all. So the Housatonic went down, killed 5 men, but during the testing of the Hunley, 21 men died. We'd say 22. Because after the second singing, she was so nasty inside that Dixon ordered brushes, a keg of lime, and 10 Negroes to clean her out. And during the cleanup, one of the black men slipped in the top of the Hunley, cracked his skull, and went in the water. So a total of 22. That's in my story. Are there any questions? Yes.
Was there ever a payout?
What?
Was there ever a payout for singing that bullet?
A payoff?
Yes.
To whom? To whom? No, there was never payout. As a matter of fact, in the interest that when Smith and Bradford went down to bring it up, they were promised a certain amount of money to bring up the Hunley, and they got the Hunley up safely, and the Confederate government stiffed them. So, what can you say?
You know, was it good gone to their relatives?
No, they didn't. Yeah, their whole thing was, well, they're dead. We're all leaving out.
Approximately, how many feet or mile, or how far was it away from where it was a tent?
Well, it's hard to say, about 500 yards. And seaward, she was still drifting to sea. Like I said, they could not fight the tide. They knew they couldn't fight the tide. They went up, as they went up to the Housatonic, the tide was going on. During the attack, the tide was going on. After the attack, the tide was still going on. There was no way they could have fought the tide back. Plus, they had to run a gauntlet. You have to understand that after the Housatonic went down,
She had 3 boats out. Connecticut came in. She had boats out. It was swarming with ticket boats. They had one that was called calcium lights. They were extremely bright white lights. They were looking for them. They were looking for it. They thought it was a day. They didn't know it was a true submarine. They were looking for it. So, what's on? Yes.
What did they use for a light down there before, when they were just going anywhere?
1 6-inch candle was all they had inside. As a matter of fact, it was so dark in the Hunley that Dixon couldn't even see his last 2 or 3 men. It was pitch dark in the back of the boat. So that's part of the thing I'm saying is those guys had some cojones. To get into that little thing, like I said, about the size of a propane tank, it was dark in there, it was smelly, the air was thick and foul, the sides, the water was cold, it was humid inside, of course, the water and frost was forming on the inside of the hull, and they knew it was a death trap. So what motivated these guys so much?
Maybe the war.
Yeah, they really thought that submarines were the answer. Now, you know, the Confederates didn't have a whole lot, they didn't have much of a Navy, they had no Air Force. That's a joke. So the Confederates came up, they invented the ironclad, they invented the torpedo, and they invented the submarines. Now, the North actually made better ironclads. The North had a submarine program, but they dragged their heels on it. Their attitude was, we sail on top of the sea, not underneath it.
Right.
So they made the alligator as sank. They didn't try much after that. But the Confederates had submarines everywhere. There were at least 4 to 6 Davids operating in Charleston Bay, at least 4 to 6 Davids operating in Mobile Bay. There were Davids operating in Galveston Bay. There were Davids operating around Willingham, North Carolina. There was Davids everywhere. They were quick too. They could go about 12, 13 knots. They were fast. As a matter of fact, there's people that think, I mentioned this in our last talk, that when Farragut attacked Mobile Bay, and when he said, oh, heck with the torpedoes full speed ahead, right after the ironclad, the double turret monitor, the Tecumseh, had hit a mine and sank. Farragut took his fleet through the minefield that said they could hear a trigger snapping on the hull. None of them went off. Why did that one go off? None of the other ones go off. Well, there was a fellow named Lieutenant Pierce they dragged out of the water, and he claimed he was commander of David, and that he had ran a Yankee boat and his mine had gone off. He didn't know if he sank it or not, but his boiler had blown up and his 2 crew members had died, and the Union sailors pulled him out of the water. Did a David sink the Tecumseh, or did the Tecumseh run into a mine? Guess we'll never know. Anything else? Okay.
Thank you. Well, we'll pause. If nobody else has any business to bring before the meeting, we'll call this one to a close, and we'll see you on
Tramp, Tramp, Tramp speaks of the misery of the Civil War prison camps and the hope of the prisoners that liberating legions were marching to their rescue. Moving ballad, "Tenting Tonight on the Old Campground," was a favorite around the campfire and in the home parlor alike. Its words are sentimental and moving. We are tired of war on the old campground. Many are dead and gone. Of the brave and true who left their homes, others have been wounded long.